So this Shabbos we're going to start the book of Devarim. The parasha itself is Devarim. And Devarim is unlike all the four books of the Torah that precede it, because this is now Moshe's personal review. It's actually this long drosha that he gives before he passes away. And he recalls all the things that happened. Now, if you look at the very first pasuk, the very first verse of the book of Devarim, these are the words that Moshe spoke to all of the Jewish people, and then it gives a description which sounds as if it's where the conversation happened. Bamidbar, Ba'arava, etc., etc. Like exactly, the almost the coordinates of where this conversation happened. And Rashi points out immediately something very interesting. He says, if you look at the nature of the book of Devarim, you'll see that Moshe, in addition to giving the Jewish people certain instructions that would be very important for their future as they would enter the land of Israel, he also rebukes them for various things that they did in the course of their 40 years in the desert. So Rashi says you will notice that when Moshe rebukes them, he does it euphemistically. So instead of telling them, for example, that they complained about the food in the desert, he just says, the desert. Like, you know what I'm referring to. It's similar to those people who've hung around each other for too long. You don't even have to say the joke. You say, remember the one about. I know exactly what you're talking about. So he's euphemistic. He says, instead of saying, you sinned in such and such a part of the desert because you complain about X, he just says, the desert. And instead of talking about the fact that they were seduced by the Midianite women in the plains of Moab, he just says, in the plains. And so he goes. He lists a whole lot of places, because Moshe, while he wants to rebuke them, he doesn't want to be, so to speak, in your face. So one of the places that is listed, which is obviously not a place, it's one of these euphemisms, in that very same first pasuk of Devarim, is called Di Zahav. Di Zahav. It's an interesting expression, because Zahav is gold, and Di sounds very much like the word die, like Dayenu. Die. Enough gold. I'd like to meet the Jewish person who says, enough gold. A little bit more, just a little bit more would be good. So what's Di Zahav, enough gold? So you have a look at what Rashi says, and he tells you that Di Zahav is the euphemism to tell us about the golden calf. Because the context over there is each place that is listed is a euphemism for one major breakdown of behavior. So Di Zahav is the one about the golden calf. So what does he say? He says that he rebuked the Jewish people, and he says, look at how you behaved. Hashem gave you the bracha, the blessing of so much gold. You should have been grateful. And where did they get all this gold? They got it from the Egyptians when they left Egypt, and then they got even more gold from the Egyptians at the sea, because the Egyptians would coat their chariots in gold. So when they all drowned, all of that gold washed up, and the Jews were incredibly wealthy at this point in time. So he says, look at you, look how you behaved. Hashem gave you gold. He gave you this incredible blessing. He gave you this unbelievable resource. You should have automatically used it as a way to serve Hashem. And instead, what did you do? You used it as a way to rebel against Hashem. So that's what he's saying in this particular section. Di Zahav. The interesting thing is that if you go back to Parashas Ki Sisa is in the second book of the Torah, and that's where you have the story of the golden calf told in real time. So here it's the review of the story, but you go back to the original story, it's very interesting. You have Moshe on the mountain, he's just received the Torah, he's got the 2 tablets, and then Hashem says to him, Lech Reid, you need to go down from this mountain, Ki Shiches Amacha, because your people has corrupted itself. In other words, they've done something which is totally antithetical to whatever happened here at Sinai. So Moshe starts to go down the mountain. Partway down the mountain, he hears chaos and he has noise, and it sounds like there's some kind of a celebration and wild behavior. So he says to Yehoshua, who had been halfway up the mountain, says, what's going on over here? Anyhow, they get a bit closer, and he sees the golden calf, and as we very well know, Moshe then breaks the tablets. He comes down to the people, he does a whole audit of who were the instigators, who was involved. Some of the people are killed. Some of the people have to drink this water to determine if they were guilty or not. And then he says to the people, you have to do teshuvah. You have to fix this. So they go through a process of doing teshuvah, after which Moshe goes back up the mountain, and now on behalf of the Jewish people, he wants to, so to speak, apologize to Hashem and ask forgiveness for the Jewish people. So what does he say when he asks forgiveness? He says, Hashem, hinei chata ha'am hazeh chata'a gedola. Behold, this people has sinned a terrible sin. Asur lahem elahei zahav. They made for themselves a god out of gold. So Rashi, the same commentator, takes those words, a god made out of gold, and this is what he explains. He says, Moshe goes to Hashem and he says to Hashem, can you blame the Jews for having made a golden calf? Look, you spoiled them. You're the one who gave them so much gold. They didn't think twice about using gold because they had so much of it. That's unfortunately what happens to people. You know, when you have a glut of something, you don't appreciate it and you can end up abusing it. So Moshe says to Hashem, he says, you gave them so much gold. That's why they landed up making a golden calf. And Rashi continues, he says, it would be like the metaphor, the parable of a king who spoiled his son rotten, gave him everything that he wanted, dressed him in the finest clothes, let him wear the best cologne, and then dropped him off outside a house of ill repute. He says, Ma yaseh haben shelo yecheta. What on earth should this kid do to stop himself from sinning? He's been dropped right down into the greatest temptation. Well, you're going to blame the kid? So similarly, Moshe says to Hashem, well, you're going to blame the Jews? You set them up for this. You gave them, these this incredible wealth. That's why they served the golden calf. So it's quite interesting because there you see that Moshe uses the gold in defense of the Jews, and here you see that Moshe uses the gold as a rebuke of the Jews. So which one is it? Which one is it? Now you can understand the logic. When Moshe is speaking to Hashem, obviously he wants to downplay the guilt of the Jews. So that's why he uses the gold as an argument on their behalf. And over here he wants to rebuke the Jews and remind them of how they should behave. So obviously he uses the gold as part of the way to rebuke them. The truth of the matter is that there's something very interesting if you look at the wording of Rashi in our parasha here, where he's supposed to rebuke them. And of course, if you want to rebuke somebody, you want to kind of escalate or highlight how bad the behavior was. You'll notice that Rashi says that he rebuked them because of the gold that they used. He doesn't say he rebuked them for using the gold. He says he rebuked them because of the gold. Now Rashi introduced this parasha by saying that when Moshe comes to rebuke the Jewish people, he does so euphemistically. So even though he wants to rebuke them, and even though this is his last opportunity because it's just before he passes away, and even though this is the time that Moshe can set them on a path of dedication to Hashem, he still softens the blow. So therefore, even when he talks about the gold, and even at the time that he says that the gold you have used for the calf is a slap in the face to Hashem because he blessed you with gold and now you've abused it, even then he still sticks in a euphemism and says, but we understand, with a lot of gold you might have been tempted to misbehave. The Rebbe tells us that there's a very powerful lesson to learn from this. And that is, firstly, on a personal level, that as a person, sometimes you're called on to criticize somebody else. It's your responsibility. Sometimes you have to point out somebody else's bad behavior. Moshe will teach you that even when you have to point out somebody's bad behavior, you should always look for a way to cushion that blow and to find a way to even bring a little bit of argument in their defense. In other words, not to be just completely harsh and critical. Second of all, this parasha is always, without fail, the parasha that we read before Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is not just a date on the calendar when terrible things happen to the Jewish nation. It's the date that commemorates the harshest rebuke from Hashem to his people. What's a greater rebuke than destroying Jerusalem and exiling us for 2,000 years? That's a huge rebuke. So that's why we read this parasha just before Tisha B'Av to teach us that even if we're going to go through a Tisha B'Av experience, and even if we're going to have difficulties in our lives, we need to know in advance that the Torah attitude is that Hashem will look for ways to soften that blow. We should never believe that harsh is always absolutely harsh. There will be a silver lining, there will be a bracha somewhere inside it. In the book of Eicha that we're going to read on the eve of Tisha B'Av, we see one of those silver linings. Eicha Yoshva Badad How could the great city of Jerusalem, that was a thriving metropolis, now sit alone, Badad, alone? Just a couple of weeks ago, we learned about Bilam, who came to curse the Jewish people and landed up blessing us. One of his blessings was that we are a nation that sits alone. We are distinct, and we don't assimilate, and we don't become part of the rest of the world. We always keep ourselves a notch above, with a set of values and a spiritual orientation that is different to everybody else's. Even at the time that we mourn the city that is alone, we're actually alluding to the fact that the Jewish nation, in spite of the destruction and in spite of the exile, will always remain distinct and special. So when Hashem brings us harshness, it is always softened with a certain element of mercy and a certain element of recognizing our goodness and our commitment even in the difficult times. So as we go into Shabbos Chazoin, the Shabbos that blesses the coming week, which includes the date of Tisha B'Av, may Hashem turn this time from being Badad, lonely, to Badad, unique, from being distant to being close, from being a time of pain to, please God, being a time of joy.